The storm over the Caucasus Wastes was not born of nature. It howled like the cries of the damned, blackened clouds churning as though the earth itself rebelled against what lay beneath. Lightning forked and flickered across the jagged peaks, casting fleeting shadows over a land that had forgotten the sun. Below the mountains, beneath kilometers of bedrock and toxic soil, a nightmare festered. It was a kingdom of ash and fire, of machines too ancient to comprehend and men twisted beyond recognition. It was the domain of the Ethnarchy, and now the Emperor had come to claim it. For decades, the Ethnarchy had defied him. Its armies, mutant, gene-forged warriors, enslaved psychers, and machines of unholy provenance, had slaughtered every force sent against them. Thousands of Thunder Warriors had been reduced to mangled corpses in the labyrinthine mountains, and nearly 1 million human auxiliaries had perished alongside them. The Ethnarch's strongholds, carved into the bones of the earth itself, had repelled every siege. The devastation was so absolute that even the Emperor, in his wisdom, had chosen not to try again. Not yet. But patience was not surrender. Years had passed, and the armies of the Unification Wars had grown stronger. The Thunder Warriors were no more, replaced by the Astartes, true transhuman warriors forged from the Emperor's own design. The fledgling 18th Legion, its ranks freshly swollen, now marched under the banner of the Raptor Imperialis. The Emperor's wrath had returned to the Caucasus Wastes, and this time nothing would be left to chance. The air inside the lander reeked of machine oil and burning incense. Brother Sergeant Dren adjusted the seal of his power armor as the compartment shuddered under the strain of descent. Around him, the warriors of the 18th Legion sat in silence, their sulfur yellow and sable armor catching the dim, flickering lumen strips overhead. The colors chosen for the volcanic rockscapes of the wastes felt strange to Dren. They were not the deep green of their earliest drills, nor the silver of their first deployment. But here, in the storm-choked shadow of the Caucasus Mountains, the mission dictated everything, even identity. Second seal checks, Dren ordered, his voice crackling through the Vox. The warriors moved instantly, their bolters, flamers, and power blades coming to life with the smooth hiss of machine spirits awakening. There was no margin for error, not here. The 18th Legion was still young, its name and legacy not yet forged in fire. Some within the War Council whispered doubts about their readiness. A fledgling force sent into the jaws of the most dangerous holdout on Terra. A fool's errand, some claimed. A suicide mission. But Dren understood the truth. The Emperor did not make gambles, he made choices. And his choices were absolute. "They think we'll break," said Gannon, seated to Dren's left. His voice came through the Vox, calm yet sharp. "The others, those who don't know us, they expect the wastes to chew us up like the Thunder Warriors." "Let them think it," Dren said, his tone iron. "We're not here to earn their approval." Gannon leaned back slightly, his helm catching the dim light as he adjusted the plasma coils of his flamer. "But do you think they're right? This place killed 1 million men before us. It killed the best the Emperor had. What makes us different?" Dren turned to him sharply. "Discipline," he said, "and the Emperor's will." The words hung heavy in the air, and Gannon said no more. 2 minutes to surface came the curt announcement of the custodian pilot over the Vox. Dren rose, gripping the overhead rail, as the lander jolted again, descending rapidly through the toxic skies. "Weapons ready," he barked. Across the compartment, bolters hummed to life. Chainswords growled as they powered up, and melta-charges clicked into place on harnesses. The warriors of the 18th Legion moved as one, their training flawless, their precision absolute. The lander's ramp began to descend, and the storm outside howled in rage. Bitter winds, heavy with ash and the tang of ozone, roared into the cabin. The wastes sprawled before them like a vision of hell. The ground was a barren expanse of blackened rock and ash, split by glowing fissures that bled luminous green vapors into the air. Far ahead, jagged mountains loomed, their peaks crowned with swirling storm clouds and lances of green lightning. Between them, silhouetted against the poisoned sky, stood the Ethnarchy's towers, dark monoliths that pierced the horizon like spears. Dren descended first, boots sinking into the ashen soil. Behind him, the warriors of the 18th Legion disembarked in perfect silence, their movements a stark contrast to the chaos of the storm. His helmet's visor lit with radiation warnings, but he paid them no mind. They were not here to survive, they were here to kill. "Form up," Dren growled, his voice cold and steady. The warriors spread out in combat formation, bolters raised, their sulfur and black armor blending with the shadows of the wastes. "The towers are ahead," said Ganon, stepping up beside him, his flamer ready. "They'll see us coming." "They'll try to stop us," Dren replied, turning his gaze to the horizon where the Ethnarchy's strongholds loomed. "And they'll fail." The storm roared again, but the warriors pressed forward, their figures swallowed by the poisoned air and the shadow of the mountains. The wastes swallowed sound as completely as they did light. Every step of the 18th Legion felt muted, their boots sinking into ash that clung and pulled like wet sand. Dren moved at the head of the formation, his bolter held ready, visor scanning the horizon. The Ethnarchy was known for its cruelty, but more than that, for its cunning. Every step taken in their territory was under watch. Every moment was a potential trap. Movement to the south came the low murmur of Brother Torin over the Vox. His voice was calm, unshaken. "Small, could be local wildlife. Or a lure," Ganon muttered from Dren's left, his grip firm on the flamer resting across his armored chest. "Hold formation," Dren ordered, raising a clenched fist. The column halted, their armor blending into the ash-choked wasteland. He adjusted his visor, scanning the location Torin had marked. There, beyond the ridge of broken rock, the air seemed wrong. The ash swirled too tightly in localized spirals, as though disturbed by something moving beneath it. A faint shimmer caught his eye, momentary and fleeting, like sunlight glinting off metal. "Steady," Dren growled, his voice firm. "Torin, keep watch. No movement unless confirmed." "Understood," Torin replied, his bolter held high as he scanned the ridge. The warriors resumed their advance, slow and deliberate. The air grew heavier the further they pressed into the wastes. Here, the land was fractured and unstable, the ground split by ancient seismic activity. Around them, crumbling towers jutted from the rock, half buried in ash and pockmarked with age. Some bore the scars of the Thunder Warriors' failed assault, their surfaces cratered and burned. Others were pristine, untouched, and eerily silent. Dren paused by one such structure, a broken pillar half buried in the ash. Its surface was carved with geometric patterns, faintly glowing in the stormlight. He felt a faint hum emanating from it, so low it seemed to vibrate in his bones. "Relic of old night?" Ganon asked, stepping up beside him. "Perhaps," Dren muttered. The artifact's presence felt wrong, heavy with the weight of forgotten things. He turned away and motioned for the column to move. "But it's not our concern." They pressed on, the wastes pulling at their senses. The storm wind's masked sound, the ash obscured vision, and beneath it all, the faint hum of power fields throbbed like a heartbeat, resonating deep within the earth. Somewhere far below, the Ethnarchy's war machines churned, their power bleeding into the poisoned air. It was Torin who spoke first. "Contact." Dren froze, raising a clenched fist. His visor locked onto the ridge ahead, where the ash began to swirl unnaturally. At first, it seemed like wind, but the movement was too deliberate, too calculated. The shapes came moments later, figures emerging from the haze, crouched low and moving with predatory grace. Dren counted at least a dozen. "Caucasus," Ganon muttered, his voice tense. Dren studied the figures, their forms hunched and distorted. As they came closer, his visor began to pick out details. Twisted limbs, warped musculature, and armor that seemed fused into their flesh. Their faces were hidden behind crude masks of iron and bone, and their eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. "Hold fire," Dren ordered. "Wait for the signal." The Caucasus moved in silence, spreading out like a pack of hunting predators. Their movements were too coordinated, too intelligent for simple beasts. They stalked the Astartes, testing their formation, waiting for an opening. The first Caucasus broke into a sprint, its clawed feet digging into the ash as it charged the line. Behind it, the others followed, their forms a blur of motion. "Fire," Dren commanded. The roar of bolters shattered the silence. Explosive rounds tore into the charging figures, ripping through flesh and armor. The first wave fell, their bodies crumpling into the ash, but more surged forward, undeterred. Ganon stepped forward, unleashing a wave of fire that consumed the front line of attackers, their warped bodies thrashing as they burned. "They're flanking," Torin shouted. Dren turned to see more Caucasus emerging from the fissures to their right, moving with unnerving speed. "Ganon, right side!" Dren barked, turning his bolter on the new threat. Ganon pivoted, his flamer spitting a torrent of fire that forced the attackers back, but Dren knew this was only the beginning. The Urkasis were relentless, and this was just their vanguard. Far ahead, the black towers of the Ethnarchy loomed, and Dren felt the weight what lay beyond. This would not be a simple war, it would be a crucible. The valley exhaled death. Ash and vapor swirled around the advancing warriors of the 18th Legion, clinging to their armor and muffling their steps. Dren moved at the head of the column, his bolter ready, eyes scanning the wreckage ahead. Tanks and artillery pieces from some forgotten war lay half-buried in the soil, their rusted hulks twisted and broken. Among the debris were bones, human and otherwise, scattered like discarded fragments of history. "This is where they broke the Thunder Warriors," Ganon muttered, his voice low. "The Ethnarch's work." Dren didn't reply. He'd heard the stories. He didn't need reminding of what had come before them. His visor locked onto the jagged outlines of the Ethnarchy's towers far ahead, barely visible through the toxic haze. The air carried a faint hum, low, persistent, and unnerving. "Keep moving," he ordered, his voice calm over the vox. "No gaps in the formation." The column descended further into the valley, the ground shifting uneasily beneath their boots. The storm above flickered with green lightning, casting fleeting shadows over the wreckage. Somewhere far below, the Ethnarchy's machines churned, their presence felt in every tremor of the earth. "Contact," Torrin said suddenly. His voice was sharp, cutting through the static on the vox. "North ridge, motion." Dren raised a fist to halt the line, his visor locked onto the ridge, scanning for movement. At first, the ash seemed to swirl on its own, but then the shapes emerged. Hulking, insectile constructs of ancient metal, their segmented legs scraping against the rock. Their glowing eyes pulsed faintly, like dying stars in the mist. "Automata," Dren said coldly. The lead construct shifted, its limbs grinding audibly as it turned toward the Astartes. Then it lunged. "Fire!" Dren roared. The valley erupted with bolter fire, explosive rounds ripping into the construct's corroded frame. It staggered under the assault, sparks flying from its joints, but still it pushed forward. Ganon stepped into position, a torrent of flame roaring from his weapon and engulfing the construct in fire. The machine collapsed, its glowing eyes fading as its body melted into slag. More emerged from the mist, their weapons flaring to life. Green energy lanced through the air, cutting into the ground and hurling ash skyward. "They're flanking!" Torrin shouted. "Hold the line!" Dren barked. He fired into another construct, its head shattering under the force of a bolter round. But for every machine that fell, more seemed to rise from the depths of the valley, their hulking forms relentless in their advance. "Push through," Dren growled, his voice hard over the vox. "We don't falter. Not here." The constructs came like shadows given form, their segmented legs scraping over rock and ash with an unnerving, rhythmic precision. Dren's bolter barked with controlled fury, each shot aimed to disable rather than destroy outright. The automata were old, their movements sluggish in places, their bodies pitted and warped by time, but they were no less dangerous. One of them closed the distance too quickly, its energy lance firing in rapid bursts. A bolt round caught it in the chest, but it only staggered, swinging a jagged limb toward Dren's head. He ducked low, pivoting as the claw swiped over him, then fired point-blank into the machine's head. Sparks erupted as its glowing eyes dimmed and the automaton collapsed, its limbs twitching in death spasms. "Left flank!" Ganon's shout cut through the vox. Dren turned, catching sight of another machine bounding toward their position, faster than the rest. It scuttled over the wreckage like an animal, a curved blade extending from its forelimb. Before it could strike, Ganon's flamer roared to life, consuming it in a flood of searing fire. The automaton shrieked, its metallic body buckling and collapsing under the heat. "Their numbers are thinning," Torrin called from his vantage point. "For now," Dren replied, his voice grim. "They're testing us, not committing." The column tightened its formation, moving steadily toward the far ridge. The valley still hummed with unseen power, and the air carried a bitter, electric taste. Every step closer to the Ethnarchy's strongholds felt heavier, the storm above growing louder, as though the wastes themselves sought to push them back. Ahead, the ground began to shift. The ash rippled unnaturally, vibrating in sync with the low hum that pulsed through the air. "Something's coming," Torrin warned, his voice tight. "Prepare for anything," Dren ordered, raising his bolter. From the ash, the ground erupted. A massive construct, far larger than the others, tore itself free from the earth. Its form was monstrous. Half buried in cables, its frame bristling with weaponry and blackened plates. Unlike the smaller automata, this one moved with intent, its glowing eyes locking onto the Astartes as its energy weapons charged with an audible whine. "Target priority," Dren snapped. "Bring it down." The warriors opened fire as one, bolter rounds hammering the machine's armor. Explosions sparked across its surface, but the construct barely slowed. It advanced steadily, its weapons spitting green fire that sliced through the ash and sent rock fragments flying. One of the shots clipped an Astartes to Dren's right, sending him sprawling to the ground with a deep gouge in his armor. "Focus fire on the joints," Dren shouted, shifting his aim. He unleashed a volley of shots at the machine's legs, targeting the exposed servos and hydraulic supports. Ganon moved to his side, flames surging toward the beast, but its thick plating deflected much of the heat. The construct lashed out with a massive clawed arm, swiping through the ash and carving deep furrows into the ground. The Astartes scattered, moving with precision to avoid its strikes while maintaining fire. Another burst of concentrated bolter fire hit its right leg, and the machine faltered, its movement slowing. "Press it!" Dren roared. The Legion advanced, their firepower relentless. The construct shuddered as more rounds tore into its vulnerable joints. Finally, with a groan of overstressed metal, it collapsed, its bulk crashing into the ground with a thunderous impact. Its weapons flickered once, then went dark. Silence fell over the valley, broken only by the crackling of flames and the distant howl of the storm. "Status?" Dren asked, turning to survey his squad. "Minor wounds," Ganon reported. "We're intact." Dren nodded, lowering his bolter but not relaxing. The valley felt quieter now, but it wasn't peace. It was the stillness before the next blow. He stared ahead at the ridge where the path climbed higher toward the black towers of the Ethnarchy. "This was a warning," Dren muttered. "They wanted us to see what's waiting for us." "Then we keep going," Ganon said, his tone as steady as ever. "We've seen worse." Dren didn't reply, but his gaze lingered on the towers ahead. The Ethnarch was watching. Of that, he was certain. The climb toward the ridge was slow and methodical, each step stirring loose stone and ash that slid soundlessly into the void below. Dren kept his bolter raised, his eyes fixed on the sharp horizon. The stillness here was unnatural. The hum that had pressed against their senses in the valley was gone, replaced by a silence so complete it felt as though the world itself was holding its breath. "They're waiting," Torrhen said over the Vox, his voice tight. "Feels like an ambush." "Everything here is," Dren replied. "Stay alert." The ridge loomed ahead, a jagged wall of black rock scored with ancient fractures. Beyond it, the faint silhouettes of the Ethnarchy's towers pierced the haze, their angular forms stark and menacing. The air felt heavier the closer they drew, like stepping into the gravitational pull of some unseen force. Dren could feel it thrumming faintly through his armor. A sensation, not a sound. "Summit in sight," Ganon reported, his flamer humming faintly as the cooling system cycled from the last engagement. "Nothing moving yet." "They'll be there," Dren said. He raised a fist, halting the column. "Torrhen, scout ahead. Find our path." Torrhen moved quickly, his boots gripping the unstable ground as he ascended the last stretch of the ridge. He disappeared over the crest, his form blending into the rock and shadow, leaving the rest of the column to fan out below. The ash swirled less fiercely here, the air thinner at altitude, but the oppressive weight of the Ethnarchy's presence pressed down like a shadow. A moment later, Torrhen's voice came over the Vox. "Summit clear, but structures ahead. Active. There's movement." "Enemy forces?" Dren asked. "Humanoids," Torrhen replied, his voice measured. "Not automata. Moving strangely. Controlled." Dren gestured for the column to follow. "We'll see for ourselves. Advance." The warriors climbed steadily, their armor clinking softly against the loose rock as they scaled the ridge. At the summit, the landscape spread out before them, a plateau fractured by deep fissures and webbed with thin, spindly structures. The towers gleamed faintly in the stormlight, their sharp edges seeming to cut against the ash-choked horizon. Conduits, too perfect and angular to be of human design, snaked across the ground, their surfaces glowing with a faint green luminescence. "It's alive!" Ganon muttered. He gestured toward the towers, his voice tense. "The ground, the machines, it's all one thing." Dren studied the scene, his visor tagging the energy signatures pulsing through the conduits. The faint tremors underfoot were rhythmic, synchronized with the lights traveling along the cables. The entire plateau seemed to be part of a single system, a breathing, functional relic from a past too old to understand. "They're not from this time," Dren said, his voice quiet. "The Ethnarchy didn't build this, they're using it." "Contact," Torrin interrupted, marking a waypoint on the Astartes' HUDs. Dren followed the marker, his visor locking onto movement between the towers. Figures emerged, stepping awkwardly into the open. At first glance, they resembled the Caucasus, twisted humanoid forms, their bodies warped by genetic manipulation. But something was wrong. Their movements were jerky, stuttering as though each step was commanded by something external. Their eyes burned with the same green light as the conduits, and their mouths hung slack as though stripped of all will. "They're being controlled," Gannon said, disgust creeping into his voice. "Not alive, not fully," Torrin added. "They're puppets." Dren raised his bolter. "Take them out." The first volley cut through the figures with ease. Bolter fire punched into flesh and shattered bone, and the bodies collapsed like broken marionettes. There were no screams, no cries of pain, only the wet thud of meat hitting the ash. But for every one that fell, more emerged from the shadows of the towers, moving in uneven waves. "Delay tactics," Dren said as he fired another precise shot, dropping a puppet mid-step. "They're stalling us." "For what?" Gannon asked, his flamer spitting fire into another cluster of bodies. The green light in their eyes dimmed as they collapsed, ichor pooling at their feet. "The towers," Dren replied, his voice grim. He scanned the energy signatures again, tracking the pulses as they quickened. "They're feeding something. The Ethnarch's getting ready." The air on the plateau felt heavier with every step, pressing against the warriors of the 18th Legion like an invisible weight. Dren advanced cautiously, his bolter raised. Around him, the controlled figures continued to stumble forward in uneven waves, their glowing eyes dim and lifeless. Each fell quickly, their jerking movements no match for disciplined bolter fire. "They're sending more," Torrin said, his voice steady over the vox. "Slow, scattered, no threat." "They're not supposed to be," Dren replied, stepping over the remains of one of the puppets. His gaze remained fixed on the tallest tower at the plateau's edge. "This isn't a fight, it's a signal." "Signal to what?" Gannon asked, sending a burst of flame into another group of advancing figures. They collapsed silently, their bodies burning to ash. Dren didn't answer immediately. The hum beneath the plateau was growing stronger, a low vibration he could feel in his armor. The conduits, pulsing with green light, twisted across the ground like veins feeding power to the towering structures above. Whatever the Ethnarch was preparing, it was already in motion. "Something's waking up," Dren said, "and we're walking into it." The column moved toward a central point where the conduits converged. The structure at the nexus was circular, its surface engraved with sharp alien patterns that glowed faintly. The ground around it trembled slightly, the air shimmering with distorted light. "Torrin," Dren said, his voice cutting through the static. "Scan it. Look for weaknesses." Torrin crouched by the nexus, his visor flickering as he ran diagnostics. "The power is unstable, building faster than it can vent. If it goes critical," a deafening crack split the air, the ground shaking violently. From the base of the largest tower, something began to rise. "Hostiles!" Torrin snapped. "Multiple signatures." A massive figure emerged from the shadows. Towering and grotesque, it was a hybrid of flesh and machinery, its body reinforced with thick plating bolted into warped muscle. Glowing green light radiated from its core, mirroring the conduits. It moved with deadly precision, unlike the shambling puppets that had come before. "Caucasus," Gannon muttered, tightening his grip on the flamer. More figures stepped into view, each one a monstrous, weaponized version of the Ethnarch's gene-forged warriors. Their movements were deliberate, coordinated. These were not drones or distractions. These were killers. "Form up," Dren barked. The Astartes shifted instantly into formation, their bolters aimed and ready. "Target the joints and expose systems. Do not let them close." The first Caucasus charged, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. Bolter fire hammered into its armor, cracking and denting its plates, but it didn't slow. Dren aimed for its exposed spine, firing a burst that sent sparks flying. It staggered, just long enough for Gannon's flamer to wash over it, reducing it to a smoldering ruin. They're protecting the Nexus, Dren growled as more of the warriors advanced, their energy weapons flaring with sickly green light. We take it out now. Ganon reached for a melta charge at his belt. Blow it? Do it, Dren ordered, his voice hard as the ground shook again. We end this here. The plateau erupted with motion. The three Urkasis advanced in unison, their heavy footfalls cracking the conduit-lined ground. They moved with a precision that set them apart from the mindless puppets, their hulking forms bristling with weaponized limbs and reinforced armor. Dren fired, his bolter rounds punching into one of the creature's shoulders. Sparks flew as the plating cracked, but the monster pressed forward, its glowing weapon arm beginning to charge with green light. They're not retreating, Tauren warned, his voice sharp over the vox. They're holding the line. They're buying time, Dren growled, stepping forward to unload another burst of fire into the lead Urkasis. We're breaking through. Focus fire! One of the creatures raised its lance-like weapon, unleashing a searing green beam that lanced through the ash-choked air. The blast struck the ground just short of the Astartes line, the resulting explosion sending chunks of rock and molten debris flying. Dren ducked low, shielded by his armor as the heat wave rippled past him. The distraction, however, gave another Urkasis the opening it needed. It charged, its clawed limb arcing toward Ganon, who stepped into the blow with calculated precision. His flamer roared, bathing the monster in fire. The creature staggered, its armor melting into bubbling slag, but it lashed out wildly, clipping Ganon's shoulder guard and sending him back a step. Tauren's bolter cracked sharply, 2 shots punching into the Urkasi's exposed neck cables. The creature let out a mechanical groan as it collapsed, green sparks sputtering from its wounds. Advance, Dren barked. The Astartes surged forward, their bolters barking as the second Urkasis fell, its core ruptured by concentrated fire. The third was slower, its left leg crippled by Ganon's flamer, and it collapsed to its knees before Dren placed a clean shot through its glowing core. The ground beneath their boots shuddered violently. Dren turned toward the Nexus in time to see a massive surge of energy erupt from its center, a wave of blinding green light radiating outward. His visor flickered as static crackled in his ears and proximity warnings flared across his HUD. Energy spike! Tauren called out, his voice cutting through the interference. The whole structure is destabilizing. Dren's eyes locked on the tallest tower, now glowing so brightly that it cast jagged shadows across the plateau. The tower was feeding the Nexus, conduits pouring raw power into the central structure. Whatever the Ethnarch was planning, it was happening now. If they didn't act, the entire plateau could erupt, and take them with it. Set charges, Dren barked. We're blowing it now! Ganon was already moving toward the Nexus, his steps sure despite the unstable terrain. The conduits pulsed faster as he approached, the green light intensifying with every second. More movement stirred at the edges of Dren's vision. Shapes detached from the shadows of the towers, new figures smaller and faster than the Urkasis. They skittered over the rock on clawed limbs, moving with unnatural speed. Tauren, suppressive fire! Dren ordered, raising his bolter to target the oncoming swarm. Ganon, make it quick! Tauren shifted to higher ground, his bolter firing in disciplined bursts. The smaller creatures fell easily under the Astartes' fire, but their speed made them hard to track. Dren's shots slammed into one of the attackers, shattering its malformed head. 2 more darted past the line of fire, closing the gap between the swarm and Ganon. Dren didn't hesitate. He surged forward, firing point blank into the nearest skittering form. Its twisted body exploded under the impact, but another lunged at him from the side. He pivoted, raising his bolter just in time to fire into its center mass, sending it sprawling. Charges set! Ganon's voice cut through the chaos. Detonator primed! Fall back! Dren shouted, his bolter firing as he covered Ganon's retreat. The smaller creatures were relentless, hissing and clicking as they closed in. Tauren's fire cut a swath through the swarm, but more poured out from behind the towers, their numbers growing with every second. Ganon reached Dren's position, his flamer sweeping in wide arcs to hold back the tide. Dren slammed his fist against Ganon's pauldron, signaling the retreat. The Astartes began pulling back, their movements disciplined even as the plateau quaked violently beneath their boots. The Nexus pulsed again, its light now blinding, the air around it rippling with raw energy. Detonate it, Dren barked. Ganon didn't hesitate. The plateau lit up as the charges detonated, a massive explosion ripping through the Nexus. Conduits snapped and burst, sending streams of green light arcing into the air. The ground cracked and split beneath the shockwave, and the nearest tower collapsed, its structure crumbling into the churning ash. The smaller creatures screamed, a high-pitched, unnatural sound as they were caught in the blast, their forms disintegrating under the force. The Astartes regrouped on the ridge, watching as the destruction spread across the plateau. The Nexus collapsed in on itself, the green light fading into nothingness. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then the tallest tower flared to life, its peak glowing with an intensity that dwarfed the Nexus. The tremors beneath their feet grew stronger, and Dren felt a sharp, electric charge run through his armor. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice grim. The storm above the plateau deepened, ash swirling into a thick, suffocating cloud as the tallest tower surged with violent energy. The green glow that had pulsed steadily moments before now flickered erratically, casting jagged shadows across the fractured terrain. Dren felt the vibrations intensify beneath his boots, sharper and more chaotic than before. This wasn't just instability. This was collapse. "Movement, upper levels," Torin called out, his bolter snapping toward the tower. The squad's HUDs lit up with multiple targets. Figures began to emerge from the tower's surface, crawling along the black, angular spines like predators descending a carcass. Unlike the skittering creatures from before, these were sleek, spider-like constructs with segmented limbs that clung to the vertical surfaces effortlessly. Their glowing cores pulsed in sync with the tower's energy, their bodies humming with barely restrained power. "New pattern," Torin muttered. "They're faster." "They're coming straight for us," Ganon said, his flamer already humming in anticipation. "Hold position," Dren barked. He raised his bolter, tracking the nearest construct as it leapt from the tower's surface, hurtling toward the squad with unnerving speed. His first shot caught it midair, the explosive round punching through its center. The creature exploded in a burst of green light, its fragments raining down like molten shards. Two more constructs darted forward, their jagged legs slicing through the ash as they charged. Torin dropped one with a clean shot to its core, while the second lunged at Ganon, its limbs crackling with energy. Ganon stepped into the strike, flames roaring as he bathed the construct in fire. It shrieked, a high-pitched, mechanical scream before collapsing into a melted heap. "They're using the tower's energy to reinforce themselves," Dren said, his voice grim. His visor tracked the remaining constructs, which had begun to spread out, circling the squad like a pack of predators. "They're protecting something." His eyes flicked to the tower's peak. The glow had become blinding now, the green light stabbing into the storm clouds above. Energy arced across its surface in erratic bursts, and the air around it shimmered with distortion. Something was building within it, something far greater than the Nexus they had destroyed. "This tower is the key," Dren muttered. "Torin, I want targeting data on that peak. Ganon, keep those things off us." "Copy," Torin replied, his visor flickering as he scanned the structure. Ganon pivoted, unleashing another wave of fire as two more constructs rushed their position. One fell, its body crumpling in the flames, but the other dodged with unnatural speed, leaping toward Dren. The creature's clawed limb raked across his pauldron, sparks flying as it tore a shallow gouge in the armor. Dren retaliated instantly, his bolter firing point-blank into its core. The shot blew the construct apart, its fragments scattering across the cracked ground. "They're adapting," Torin said, firing into another that had begun to climb the ridge. "Faster movement, tighter attack patterns. They're not just defending, they're trying to drive us back." "They're failing." Dren growled. He stepped forward, raising his bolter to fire into the legs of a construct attempting to flank their position. Its limbs shattered under the impact, and it collapsed, twitching. Torin's voice cut in sharply. "Got it. The tower's energy is concentrated at the apex. Whatever's inside, it's not stable. If we hit it hard enough, it'll cascade through the entire structure." "Good," Dren said. "What about the base? Can we collapse it?" Torin hesitated, his visor flashing with calculations. "Possible, but not guaranteed. The apex is the safer target." "Safer isn't in our orders," Dren replied. He turned toward Ganon, who was already pulling a melt-a-charge from his belt. "We take the base." The ground beneath them shuddered violently, almost throwing Dren off balance. A deafening roar echoed from the tower as another surge of energy erupted from its core, green lightning arcing outward in jagged streaks. One bolt struck the ground near the squad, hurling ash and molten rock into the air. Static screamed through their Vox channels, and for a brief moment, Dren's visor flickered with interference. "Move now," he shouted, gesturing for Ganon to break toward the tower. The Astartes moved as one, bolters firing in overlapping bursts as the remaining constructs swarmed to intercept them. Ganon reached the base first, his movements swift and deliberate as he set the melt-a-charge against one of the tower's massive supports. The structure groaned, its surface rippling with energy as the charge locked into place. 30 seconds, Ganon called out, retreating toward the squad. The constructs, sensing the threat, surged forward in a desperate assault. Dren stepped into their path, firing controlled bursts that shattered limbs and ruptured glowing cores. Tauren covered their flank, his bolter precise as ever, but the swarm was relentless. One of the constructs leapt past their line, its claws extended toward Ganon. Dren intercepted it with a burst of fire, the explosive rounds ripping through its midsection. The construct crumpled, but another replaced it almost immediately, its limbs striking like scythes. This time, Ganon met it with his flamer, the creature's body engulfed in fire as it collapsed. "Fall back," Dren ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. The squad pulled away from the tower, their movements swift and disciplined, even as the ground beneath them fractured further. The tower groaned again, its structure trembling under the strain of its own energy. 10 seconds! Ganon shouted, his voice steady despite the rising intensity of the battle. The squad cleared the immediate area just as the melt-a-charge detonated. The explosion ripped through the tower's support, molten debris spraying in all directions. The entire structure swayed, its upper levels cracking and collapsing in slow, agonizing motion. The green light at its apex flared one final time before winking out, the tower crumbling into the ash below. Silence descended, broken only by the distant rumble of the storm. Dren stared at the ruins, his visor scanning for any remaining energy signatures. The tremors beneath their feet had stopped, but the ash still hung heavy in the air. He turned to Tauren. "Report," he said. Tauren scanned the rubble, his voice grim. "No movement, for now." Dren nodded, his gaze turning to the horizon. The storm still churned, and in the distance, the silhouettes of the other towers remained, their dark forms untouched by the destruction. "This is just the beginning," he muttered. The silence after the tower's collapse felt wrong, heavy with anticipation. Dren scanned the ruins, his bolter raised, as ash swirled faintly in the air. The green light was gone, but the storm above churned darkly, lightning flickering in the distance. The squad formed up, weapons ready, but the battlefield was unnervingly quiet. "Report," Dren ordered. "No hostiles detected," Tauren replied. "Energy readings are... Wait, something's building below." Dren turned sharply as the rubble near the tower's base began to shift. The ground beneath it trembled, heavier and deeper than before. A faint red glow began to seep from the cracks, spilling out like blood into the ash. The air vibrated, and the sensation clawed at the edges of Dren's senses, unnatural and oppressive. "Tauren," Dren said, his voice hard. "What's down there?" Tauren's visor flickered as he scanned the disturbance. "It's a vault, or something like it. Pre-strife tech. The explosion must have cracked it open." Before Dren could respond, the fissure erupted. A shockwave of red light tore through the air, hurling debris and ash outward. Dren braced as the ground collapsed inward, revealing a massive, mechanical form rising from the depths. It was a towering fusion of jagged armor and pulsating organic light, its spindly limbs tipped with claws that sparked with energy. Its core glowed with swirling red light, radiating power. "Target identified," Tauren said. "That thing's a walking reactor." The machine turned its glowing eyes toward them, moving with terrifying speed. Its claws slammed into the ground, sending a ripple of force through the rubble. "Engage!" Dren roared. Bolter fire erupted, slamming into the creature's armor, but the impacts barely slowed it. The machine lunged, its claws arcing toward Ganon, who countered with a surge of flame. The creature faltered briefly, its core dimming, but then straightened, its body glowing red-hot as if absorbing the heat. "It's feeding on energy," Tauren shouted. Dren fired into an exposed conduit along its side, sparks flying as the creature staggered. "Hit the weak points," he ordered, raising his bolter for another shot. The red glow in its core pulsed faster, the hum deepening. This fight was far from over. The creature's core flared violently, casting the battlefield in flickering shades of red. Each pulse seemed to thrum through the ground, shaking loose rubble and ash as it advanced. Dren moved in sync with the squad. Bolter aimed at the exposed conduits snaking along its armored torso. His shots hit true, sparks bursting as metal shattered, but the machine adjusted, shifting its stance to protect its damaged side. "It's adapting," Torin called out, firing into the joints of one of its legs. The construct stumbled briefly before stabilizing, its movements growing sharper, more deliberate. "Conduits are vulnerable," Dren growled. "Stay coordinated." Ganon flanked left, his flamer unleashing another torrent of fire. The creature recoiled, its limbs jerking unnaturally, but its core flared again, absorbing the heat and converting it into a new surge of energy. A crackling beam erupted from its outstretched claw, narrowly missing Ganon as it seared across the ground, leaving molten trails in its wake. "It's using what we throw at it," Ganon shouted, retreating toward cover. "Keep the pressure on!" Dren snapped. He advanced toward the creature's side, firing at its cracked armor. Bolter fire punched through another conduit, causing the red light to flicker erratically. The machine staggered, its core dimming for a moment, but it recovered, turning its glowing eyes toward Dren. The creature lunged, its clawed limbs slamming down in an arc that cracked the ground where Dren had stood. He dove aside, rolling back to his feet and firing point blank into its exposed joint. The explosion ripped through its limb, severing it at the elbow. The machine reeled, letting out a mechanical screech, but the glow of its core only intensified. "Dren, it's overloading!" Torin shouted, his voice taut. "Energy readings are spiking. If it detonates, we're dead if it does." Dren snapped. "Focus fire on the core." The squad regrouped, their bolters firing in coordinated bursts. Explosive rounds hammered into the construct's center mass, each impact sending ripples of energy through its glowing core. The red light began to pulse erratically, flashes of heat and light spilling outward with every hit. The machine lashed out in desperation, its remaining claws swiping wildly as it tried to close the distance. Ganon stepped forward, his flamer roaring to life as he bathed its torso in fire. The creature staggered under the assault, its armor melting and splitting open to reveal the glowing core beneath. "Now!" Dren barked. He fired a precise burst into the exposed core. The round struck home, and for a brief moment the construct froze, its limbs twitching as sparks erupted from its body. Then, with a final blinding pulse of red light, the core detonated. The explosion hurled the squad backward, a wave of heat and debris engulfing the battlefield. Dren hit the ground hard, his armor absorbing most of the impact. Static filled his visor as the blast subsided, leaving only the faint rumble of collapsing rubble and the distant howl of the storm. "Status," Dren coughed, forcing himself upright. "Alive," Ganon replied, his voice strained. He staggered to his feet, smoke rising from the scorch marks on his armor. "Torin?" Dren asked. "I'm here," Torin said, pulling himself from the rubble. His bolter was still in hand, though its barrel was dented. The machine's down, energy signatures are gone. Dren stood, surveying the remains of the construct. Its limbs lay scattered across the ground, charred and lifeless, while its core was nothing more than a smoldering crater. The air was thick with the stench of burnt metal and ash, but the oppressive hum that had filled the battlefield was gone. "This wasn't random," Dren said after a moment, his tone grim. "The Ethnarch knew we'd come here. This thing, it wasn't just a weapon, it was a message." Torin stepped beside him, scanning the horizon. The other towers remained, dark and foreboding, their silhouettes barely visible through the swirling storm. "If that was a message," he said, "I don't think we've heard the whole thing." Dren nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The storm raged on, and somewhere beyond the remaining towers, the Ethnarch was waiting. "Regroup," he ordered. "We're not done yet." The squad moved cautiously toward the fissure, where the faint pulse of red light glowed like a wound in the earth. Dren scanned the jagged opening, bolter raised, as heat rolled upward with a faint metallic tang that clung to the air. The collapse had revealed something vast and ancient, its metallic structures barely visible in the depths. "Energy signatures below," Torin reported, his visor flickering. "Movement's faint, but it's there. Something's waking up." "Another stronghold?" Ganon asked, his flamer held ready. "Or worse," Dren muttered. He stared into the chasm, its edges sharp and unnatural, as though carved by precision far beyond human means. The air here pressed against them, faint vibrations rippling through the ground beneath their boots. The hum began to rise, steady and rhythmic like the heartbeat of a vast machine buried deep below. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, the squad instinctively tensing as the stillness stretched on. Without warning, the fissure erupted. A burst of red light shot upward, blinding and searing. The ground trembled violently, cracks radiating outward as ash and debris rained down. From the depths, a massive shape began to rise, its jagged form outlined in the crimson glow. "What is that?" Gannon muttered, his voice low. The machine emerged fully, its body a labyrinth of interlocking plates etched with glowing runes. A single, massive crimson eye burned in the center of its head, flaring as it turned its gaze toward the squad. The hum returned, deeper now, vibrating through the rubble. "Command node," Torrin said tightly. "If it's active, everything else might be." The machine moved with deliberate, fluid precision, its limbs cracking the ground with each step. The crimson eye flared, sending a pulse of energy outward that tore into the earth and hurled debris into the air. "Move," Dren shouted, diving for cover as the machine advanced. The machine's steps shook the ground as it advanced, each one deliberate and unyielding. Dren pressed against a jagged slab of rubble, bolter raised, his visor tracking the flickering heat radiating from its massive limbs. The crimson eye burned brighter, a growing intensity that seemed to pulse in time with the vibrations beneath their boots. "Target the legs," Dren ordered. "Slow it down." Torrin fired first, his bolter rounds slamming into the joint of the nearest limb. Sparks erupted as the plating cracked, but the machine didn't falter. Gannon followed, sweeping his flamer across the exposed mechanisms. The intense heat warped the metal, forcing the construct to stagger back, its movements momentarily unsteady. "It's recalibrating," Torrin called out. "It's compensating for the damage." "Keep hitting it," Dren growled. He stepped out from cover, firing into the exposed conduits along the machine's side. His shots struck true, the red light in its eye flickering briefly before intensifying again. The machine pivoted, its massive clawed arm swinging toward Dren. He dove to the side as the limbs smashed into the ground, sending shards of rock skittering across the battlefield. Rising quickly, he fired another burst into the damaged joint, his rounds punching through and tearing cables free. The construct staggered again, its movements growing uneven. "It's not just protecting itself," Torrin said, his voice tight. "It's pushing us back. It's keeping us away from the fissure." "Then we push through," Dren snapped, shifting his aim toward the crimson eye. "Torrin, cover fire. Gannon, focus on the joints. We break this thing here." The squad moved with precision, their weapons roaring as they coordinated their assault. The machine lashed out, its remaining strength focused on scattering their formation. But as its armor buckled and its limbs began to seize, the Astartes closed in, relentless. Dren's bolter fired one last precise shot into the glowing core of its eye. The machine froze, its towering frame trembling. For a moment, silence reigned. Then the crimson light dimmed and the machine collapsed, its body crashing to the ground with a deafening roar. Dren didn't wait. Move to the fissure, now. The fissure yawned below, its jagged edges glowing faintly with pulses of red light. Dren peered into the depths where the faint outlines of metallic structures were visible, vast and unnatural. The hum, rising from below, felt heavier now, pressing against the senses like a tangible weight. "Movement," Torrin said, his voice low. "Faint heat signatures, fast." "Ambush," Dren muttered. "Torrin, take point. Gannon, secure the rear. Move." The squad descended the narrow path, spiraling downward toward the depths. The air grew hotter, the vibrations in the rock intensifying with every step. Suddenly, a spindly construct leapt from the shadows below, limbs glinting in the crimson light. Torrin fired instantly, the creature exploding in midair, shards scattering across the path. "They're swarming," Gannon shouted. Two more scuttled up the walls behind them, but a wave of fire from his flamer consumed them, their remains tumbling into the abyss. "Keep moving," Dren barked, his bolter snapping toward another attacker. The squad pressed on, their formation tightening as more constructs emerged from the darkness. The path opened into a wide platform carved into the rock. The glow of runes marked its surface, and the constructs surged forward from all sides, faster and more coordinated than before. "Torrin's suppressive fire on the left," Dren ordered. Gannon, burn the right! The Astartes fought as one, holding the line against the swarm. Bolter fire and flame cut through the constructs, scattering their fragmented remains across the platform. But the attacks didn't stop. They're testing us, Torrin muttered, firing another precise burst. Dren gritted his teeth. Then we show them what failure looks like. The last construct collapsed in a heap of twisted metal, its glowing core sputtering before fading into darkness. The platform fell silent, save for the faint hum emanating from the depths below. The squad remained in formation, their weapons raised, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Clear, Torrin reported, though his voice held no relief. No active signatures. Dren's eyes stayed fixed on the pathway ahead. The faint red glow pulsing from deeper within the fissure had grown brighter, more erratic, and the vibrations in the air felt sharper now, almost cutting. He stepped forward cautiously, the edge of the platform trembling slightly beneath his boots. We're close, he said. Whatever's down there, it's not waiting idly. Gannon moved to his side, his flamer hissing faintly in the oppressive heat. We've bled them at every turn, he said, his voice gruff. This has to be the core. Or the next layer, Dren replied, his tone flat. He turned back to the squad. Regroup and rearm. We move in 30 seconds. Torrin, keep scanning. As the Astartes adjusted their weapons and ammunition, Torrin crouched near the edge of the next pathway, his visor flickering with data streams. I'm reading a massive energy concentration ahead, he said after a moment. It's centralized, definitely powering the defenses we've faced, but it's fluctuating, like it's unstable. Which means it's vulnerable, Dren said, reloading his bolter. He glanced toward the crimson-lit corridor ahead. And guarded. Titan formation. We move now. The squad stepped onto the narrow path that led deeper into the fissure. The air grew hotter still, carrying with it the faint scent of scorched metal and something acrid, almost chemical. The hum from below was no longer a constant. It pulsed unevenly, accompanied by faint mechanical clicks that echoed off the walls. Dren felt the weight of the mission pressing heavier with every step. This wasn't just a battle. It was something older, something far more dangerous than they had anticipated, and they were walking straight into its heart. The pathway narrowed as they descended, its walls closing in with jagged, unnatural angles. The red glow ahead grew stronger, casting eerie patterns across their armor. The sound of the machinery deep below grew louder, mechanical clicks and rhythmic grinding that seemed to echo with purpose. Something's shifting, Torrin said, his visor flickering as he scanned the darkness ahead. Structures are moving. It's reconfiguring itself. It knows we're here, Dren replied, his bolter raised. Keep moving. Stay sharp. The corridor opened abruptly into a cavernous chamber, its scale dwarfing anything they had seen above. Massive pillars of metal stretched from the floor to the unseen ceiling, each one inscribed with glowing runes that pulsed like a heartbeat. In the center of the room stood a massive circular structure, an altar-like platform surrounded by concentric rings of machinery. At its core floated a sphere of pulsating red light, its surface crackling with arcs of energy. It's a nexus, Torrin said, his voice barely above a whisper. A control node for the entire network. If we destroy it, we break the Ethnarch's hold on this system, Dren finished. He advanced cautiously, his eyes fixed on the glowing sphere. But it's not going to let us do that easily. As if on cue, the chamber rumbled, and from the shadows between the pillars, shapes began to emerge. They were massive constructs, larger than any the squad had faced so far. Their forms were angular and brutal, their limbs reinforced with jagged plating. Their cores glowed with the same red light as the Nexus, and their movements were deliberate, purposeful. Hostiles, 6 o'clock, Torrin shouted. Form up, Dren barked. Suppressive fire, Gannon, keep them off the node. The first construct charged, its claws striking the ground with thunderous force. Bolter fire erupted, explosive rounds slamming into its armor. Sparks flew as its plating cracked, but it kept advancing, its glowing core pulsing faster. Torrin fired again, his shots targeting the exposed joints of its legs, and the creature stumbled, crashing to the floor in a heap of shrapnel. 2 more constructs closed in, their limbs swinging in wide arcs. Gannon met them head-on, his flamer unleashing a torrent of fire that engulfed the closest one. The construct shrieked as its armor melted, but the second lunged past the flames, its clawed arm striking toward Dren. Dren sidestepped the blow, firing into the construct's exposed side. The explosive rounds tore through its core and it collapsed in a burst of red light. He turned to the squad, his voice sharp over the vox. "Focus fire. We hold this position until the node is exposed." The squad advanced cautiously toward the nexus, their boots crunching on the uneven metallic floor of the chamber. The massive crimson sphere pulsed erratically, arcs of energy snapping across the concentric machinery that surrounded it. The hum in the air was sharper now, a rhythmic grinding that rattled through their armor. Dren tightened his grip on his bolter, his eyes scanning for movement among the towering metal pillars. Then it came. A sudden, high-pitched screech that echoed through the cavern. From the shadows of the machinery, a massive construct dropped into view. Its body was segmented and insect-like, each joint reinforced with jagged plates. Its limbs ended in serrated blades, and its glowing core pulsed in perfect sync with the nexus. "Hostile!" Torrin shouted, firing the first shot. His bolter rounds slammed into the construct's armor, sparks flying, but it didn't slow. The machine darted forward with terrifying speed, its limbs cutting into the ground as it lunged at the squad. Dren sidestepped the attack and fired into its flank. The explosive rounds tore through one of its legs, causing it to stumble, but the machine pivoted with unnatural grace, its bladed limb swinging in a wide arc. The blow caught Torrin across the chest. The Astartes was thrown back, his armor sparking as he crashed into the ground. His bolter skittered across the chamber, and for a moment he didn't move. "Torrin's down!" Gannon shouted, stepping forward to unleash a torrent of flame at the construct. The fire engulfed its upper body, melting through its plating, but it continued its assault, slamming one of its serrated limbs into the floor with enough force to crack the ground. Dren rushed to Torrin, dragging him behind a fallen section of machinery. His armor was scorched where the blade had struck, the ceramite cracked and leaking blood. Beneath the helmet, Torrin coughed, his voice tight with pain. "Chest plates breached," he muttered. "Lungs punctured. Doesn't matter. Just hold them off." "Stay still," Dren ordered. His tone was sharp, but his movements were precise as he pulled a stim pack from his belt. He jabbed it into the joint of Torrin's armor, the device hissing as it injected its contents into his bloodstream. The effect was immediate. Torrin's breathing steadied, and his blood stopped flowing as his enhanced physiology took over. The Laraman cells within him began their work, clotting the wound and regenerating damaged tissue with unnatural speed. He clenched his fist experimentally, testing his range of movement. "It's healing," Torrin said, his voice steadier now. "Still hurts like hell." "You're not done yet," Dren said, handing him his bolter. "We need you upright." Another screech tore through the chamber. The construct had shifted its attention to Gannon, who ducked under one of its bladed limbs and fired a burst of flame into its exposed joints. The machine spasmed, its movements erratic as its molten plating began to buckle. "Hit the joints!" Dren ordered, standing to rejoin the fight. Torrin, now back on his feet, raised his bolter and fired into the machine's rear leg. The shots found their mark, shattering the exposed servos and forcing the construct to collapse. Seizing the moment, Dren sprinted forward, firing into its core. The red light flickered violently as his rounds tore into its exposed mechanisms. The construct let out one final, guttural screech before collapsing, its body twitching once before going still. The chamber fell silent again, save for the relentless hum of the Nexus. Dren turned to Torrin, who was standing but leaning slightly on his bolter. "You good to move?" Dren asked. Torrin nodded. "Good enough." Dren glanced at Gannon, who was already advancing toward the Nexus. "This thing isn't done yet," Gannon muttered, his flamer still alight. "What's our play?" "We end it," Dren said. He gestured toward the glowing sphere at the center of the machinery. "We destroy the Nexus and take this whole system down." The squad closed in on the Nexus, the pulsating red sphere looming above them. Arcs of energy lashed outward, striking the surrounding machinery and leaving scorch marks across the floor. The air grew hotter with every step, thick with static that made their armor servos whine in protest. "This thing's destabilizing," Torrin said, his voice still tight from the pain of his injury. "It's not just powering the defenses, it's holding the entire structure together." "Then we make sure it falls apart," Dren replied. He scanned the machinery, his visor highlighting the tangle of conduits feeding into the glowing sphere. "Those lines, cut them and it'll collapse." Gannon moved first, his flamer sweeping across one of the massive conduits. The metal hissed and warped under the intense heat, sparks bursting from its surface as the line ruptured. The red light of the Nexus dimmed briefly, but the sphere pulsed again, brighter than before, as if reacting to the attack. "Keep going," Dren ordered. "It's compensating, but it can't sustain itself for long." Torin raised his bolter, firing precise bursts into another conduit. Each shot sent a spray of molten shards flying as the line began to fracture. The hum in the chamber grew louder, a low, resonant tone that reverberated through the floor. The machinery around the Nexus started to tremble, the runes etched into its surface, flickering erratically. "It's overloading!" Torin shouted. "We need to move fast." As if in response, the chamber shook violently, a deep groan echoing from the walls. Sections of the floor began to crack, glowing fissures spreading outward from the Nexus. From above, debris rained down, forcing the squad to scatter as chunks of metallic stone crashed around them. Dren ducked behind a pillar, his eyes locked on the sphere. The energy arcs were growing more frequent now, wild and uncontrolled, lashing out in all directions. One struck the ground near Ganon, sending him sprawling. "Ganon, report," Dren called. "I'm fine," Ganon growled, already back on his feet. He aimed his flamer at another conduit and unleashed a torrent of fire, the line rupturing in a spray of sparks and molten metal. The sphere flickered violently, its light stuttering as the machinery around it began to collapse. But instead of dimming, the Nexus pulsed one final time, its red glow surging outward in a wave that rippled through the chamber. Dren felt the impact hit him like a physical force, static crackling through his vox as his visor flickered. "Brace yourselves," he shouted, steadying himself against the trembling ground. With a deafening roar, the central machinery gave way, collapsing inward as the sphere's energy erupted in a final blinding flash. The blinding flash consumed the chamber, and for a moment all Dren could hear was the roar of collapsing machinery and the static scream of his vox. The force of the eruption hurled him backward, slamming him into the ground. His armor absorbed the brunt of the impact, but the sharp sting of heat and shrapnel pierced through his body like needles. The world blurred, red light flashing in his peripheral vision. "Dren, respond!" Torin's voice cut through the static, urgent but faint. "I'm here," Dren growled, forcing himself upright. His visor flickered as it recalibrated, faint warning runes dancing across his display. Around him, the chamber was in chaos. Massive pillars had collapsed into jagged ruins, the once pulsing red glow of the Nexus reduced to a dull, sputtering flicker. Steam hissed from ruptured conduits, and the acrid stench of burnt metal filled the air. "Status?" Dren barked, his voice hoarse. "Still alive," Ganon replied, emerging from a cloud of smoke, his flamer sputtering but operational. His armor was streaked with scorch marks, but he moved steadily, his eyes fixed on the shattered remains of the Nexus. "Torin?" Dren turned, his gaze sweeping through the haze. He found Torin leaning against a collapsed pillar, one hand pressed to his side where his armor was cracked and leaking. Despite his injuries, Torin held his bolter steady, his breathing measured. "Functional," Torin said, his tone clipped. "But this place won't hold much longer." Dren followed Torin's gaze. The ground beneath the Nexus was collapsing, sections of the floor falling away to reveal a vast, bottomless chasm. The remaining machinery groaned as it strained against its own weight, the entire structure buckling under the damage they had inflicted. "We need to move," Dren said. He gestured toward the only visible exit, a narrow passage on the far side of the chamber, its edges illuminated by the faint glow of emergency lighting. "Ganon, take point. Torin, stay with me." As they moved, the floor continued to quake, pieces of debris crashing into the chasm below. Dren felt the heat intensify, waves of it rolling upward like the breath of a slumbering giant. The destruction of the Nexus had destabilized more than just the chamber, it had awoken something deeper. Ahead, Ganon stopped suddenly, raising a hand to signal. "Contacts," he said, his voice low but steady. Dren's visor locked onto the faint outlines of movement within the corridor. Emerging from the smoke and shadows were constructs, sleeker and smaller than the ones before, their forms more humanoid. Their limbs crackled with residual energy, and their glowing eyes burned with focused intent. "They're not slowing us down this time," Dren muttered. "They're here to finish us." The first construct darted forward, faster than any they'd faced. Dren fired, his bolter barking as his rounds struck its chest. The construct staggered but didn't fall, its glowing core flaring as it lunged again. Dren sidestepped and fired a second burst, the explosive rounds punching through its head and dropping it instantly. "Ganon, burn the flanks," Dren shouted, pivoting to track another construct. Ganon's flamer roared to life, a wave of fire sweeping across the advancing enemies. Two of them collapsed under the heat, their armor melting into slag, but the others pressed forward, their movements eerily coordinated. "They're faster than before," Torin called out, his bolter cutting down one that had leapt onto the wall. "These aren't just drones, they're combat models." Dren fired into the nearest construct, his rounds shattering its arm as it lashed out toward him. The squad pressed forward, their formation tight as they carved through the opposition. The passage narrowed further, forcing the constructs into tighter clusters that made them easier targets, but their speed and coordination made every second a battle. Finally, the last construct fell, its broken body crumpling against the corridor wall. The squad didn't stop to catch their breath. Dren gestured forward, his voice sharp. "Keep moving. Whatever's waiting for us, we meet it head on." The corridor twisted sharply, the metallic walls narrowing around them like the throat of a beast. Every step brought them closer to the unseen heart of the Ethnarch stronghold, but the air itself seemed to resist their progress. It was heavy, oppressive, as though the structure were alive and straining to push them back. The hum of distant machinery had shifted, no longer steady, but uneven like a failing heartbeat. "We're heading straight into a trap," Torin muttered, his bolter sweeping the darkened passage. His breathing was audible over the vox, the strain of his earlier injuries still evident despite his transhuman physiology working to mend him. "Doesn't matter," Dren replied. His voice was calm but cold, the weight of the mission tightening around him. "We push forward. There's no turning back." Ahead, Ganon stopped abruptly, raising a fist to signal. "Something's wrong," he said, his voice low. "No movement. It's too quiet." Dren stepped forward, his visor scanning the corridor. The faint glow of emergency lighting cast long, flickering shadows, but nothing stirred. The constructs they had fought so viciously moments before were gone. The passage stretched empty before them, narrowing into darkness. "Torin, anything on Auspex?" Dren asked. Torin adjusted the scanner embedded in his gauntlet, his visor flickering as streams of data scrolled across his display. "Readings are distorted," he said. "Interference is increasing. It's deliberate. It's trying to blind us," Dren muttered, his grip tightening on his bolter. "Stay together. Watch for anything." They moved cautiously, their formation tightening as the passage sloped downward. The air grew hotter with every step, the vibrations beneath their boots becoming erratic sharper. Then, without warning, the walls on either side began to shift. The metallic plating groaned, sliding inward in jagged, mechanical motions. Panels rose from the floor, cutting across the corridor like teeth, forcing the squad into a tighter and tighter space. "It's closing us in," Ganon growled, stepping back as one of the panels scraped close to his arm. "Torin, find us a path!" Dren barked. He fired a bolt round into one of the shifting plates, but the shot ricocheted harmlessly, the surface absorbing the impact like a dull echo. Torin's scanner flared, his voice clipped. "There's a chamber ahead, 20 meters. We can reach it if we..." Before he could finish, the floor beneath them jolted violently. A section of the passage collapsed, splitting apart with a deafening roar. Dren felt himself lose footing as the ground fell away, and suddenly he was sliding downward, the steep angle pulling him into darkness. Dren's fall ended abruptly as he slammed into an unforgiving metallic surface. His armor absorbed most of the impact, but the force still jarred him, leaving him momentarily disoriented. He pushed himself upright, bolter in hand, as his visor recalibrated. Around him, the dim red glow of machinery pulsed faintly, casting jagged shadows across the chamber he now found himself in. "Report!" he barked, his voice echoing in the enclosed space. "Here!" Ganon called from a few meters away, already rising to his feet. His flamer was intact, though a streak of ash covered the lens of his helmet. "Torin?" A groan came from nearby, and Dren turned to see Torin struggling to sit up against a shattered column of machinery. His armor bore fresh cracks from the fall, but he waved off Dren's approach. "I'm functional," he said through gritted teeth. "Barely." Dren scanned the chamber. They were in a massive, circular room lined with ancient machines, their surfaces covered in angular runes that pulsed faintly like dying embers. The walls stretched upward, disappearing into darkness. In the center of the chamber stood a massive pillar-like structure, its surface glowing faintly with red light that bled into the floor like veins. "This wasn't an accident," Torin muttered, pulling himself to his feet. He gestured toward the pillar. "It's guiding us, drawing us deeper." Dren didn't respond immediately. He stepped closer to the central structure, his visor scanning its surface. The glow emanating from the pillar was uneven, flickering like a failing star. There was a strange, rhythmic clicking coming from within, almost organic despite its mechanical source. "This is the core of the system," Dren said finally, his voice grim. "The nexus we destroyed, this is what it was feeding." "Great," Ganon muttered, readying his flamer. "So what's next? This thing gonna wake up and try to kill us too?" As if in answer, the room shook violently. The pillar flared, its glow surging outward in bright, blinding pulses. Dren staggered back, his bolter snapping into position as the floor beneath the pillar began to shift. Panels slid apart, and from the depths rose something immense. It was humanoid in form, but grotesque in its construction. Its towering frame was encased in jagged plating, etched with the same runes that covered the chamber. Cables and conduits snaked across its body, feeding into a glowing core embedded in its chest. Its head was featureless except for a singular vertical slit that burned with crimson light. "It's waking up," Torin said, his voice tight. "No," Dren replied, raising his bolter. "It's been waiting." The chamber trembled with a low, resonant hum as the massive humanoid construct fully emerged from the depths of the pillar. It was colossal, standing twice the height of an Astartes, its jagged armor lined with glowing runes that pulsed in sync with the crimson slit of its single burning eye. Its movements were slow but deliberate, as if assessing the squad, its presence dominating the room like a silent executioner. "It's watching us," Torin said through gritted teeth, his bolter locked on the towering figure. "It's different." "This one's not just a drone," Dren replied, his voice low. "It's thinking." The construct moved suddenly, its motions far faster than its bulk suggested. A clawed hand slammed into the floor near Ganon, sending a shockwave that threw him off balance. He rolled clear, his flamer sputtering but intact, and unleashed a wave of fire that washed over the construct's armor. The flames licked across its jagged surface, but the Guardian barely reacted, its glowing core flaring brighter in response. "Armor's too thick," Ganon shouted, backing toward cover. "Torin, look for vulnerabilities," Dren ordered, firing his bolter into the construct's exposed joints. The explosive rounds struck, sending shards of plating scattering, but the damage was superficial. The machine shifted, raising one massive arm. Its crimson eye burned brighter, and a searing beam of light erupted from the slit, cutting across the room. "Scatter!" Dren roared. The squad dove in separate directions as the beam carved through the ground, leaving a molten scar in its wake. Torin landed hard behind a collapsed pillar, his voice strained. "That beam, it's overloading its systems when it fires. I saw it flicker." Dren's mind raced. "It leaves itself open." He turned toward Ganon. "Force it to fire again. Keep its attention on you." Ganon gave a grim nod, rising from his cover and unleashing another torrent of fire toward the machine's chest. The Guardian shifted toward him, its crimson eye flaring as energy built within the slit. The searing beam erupted once more, but Ganon had already moved, the attack barely missing him as it carved into the far wall. "There! The core flickered!" Torin called out, his bolter firing into the now exposed center of the construct's chest. The shots hit true, sparks erupting as the glow dimmed slightly. Dren didn't hesitate. He sprinted forward, weaving past the Guardian's claws as they slammed into the floor around him. Closing the gap, he aimed directly at the weakened core and fired. The rounds struck deep, and the machine recoiled, its movements faltering. "Press the attack!" Dren shouted, falling back to regroup as the Guardian's core pulsed erratically. The machine staggered, but its crimson eye burned brighter, a low, guttural hum emanating from its frame. "It's not done yet," Torin muttered, reloading his bolter. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble again, the machinery lining the chamber walls lighting up with flickering red and green hues. Dren raised his bolter, locking eyes with the towering construct. "Then we finish it." The construct let out a deep, mechanical roar, its guttural hum reverberating through the chamber as its movements grew erratic yet more aggressive. The damaged core in its chest pulsed violently, sending arcs of crimson energy lashing out across the room. One struck a nearby column, shattering it into molten fragments that rained down dangerously close to Ganon. "It's destabilizing," Torrin shouted, his voice strained as he ducked behind cover. Bolter reloaded. "If that core goes critical, we're all dead. Then we take it down before it can," Dren replied, his voice calm but resolute. "Torrin, keep hitting the weak spots. Ganon, burn those joints. I'll move in close and finish it." Ganon grimaced but didn't hesitate, stepping out of cover with his flamer roaring to life. The stream of fire engulfed the construct's left leg, the intense heat warping the armor plating and melting exposed servos. The machine faltered, its movements uneven, but it retaliated instantly. One massive clawed arm swept toward Ganon, striking the ground with enough force to send him sprawling. Dren saw his chance. While the Guardian's attention was fixed on Ganon, he sprinted forward, weaving through the debris and closing the distance. The heat from the construct's energy field seared against his armor, his visor flickering as static interference clawed at his display. The construct's glowing eye flared again, a deadly beam slicing toward Dren. He dove low, the searing light narrowly missing him and cutting a deep gash into the chamber floor. Rising quickly, he aimed his bolter at the exposed core, firing a precise burst of rounds. Each shot struck home, the pulsing light within the construct's chest dimming and sputtering as the machine let out another roar. "It's staggering," Torrin called out, bolter rounds hammering into its arm joints. Sparks flew as one of the Guardian's claws collapsed, useless, to its side. The construct lashed out wildly with its remaining arm, smashing into a pillar and sending chunks of metal and stone cascading to the floor. "Dren, now!" Ganon yelled, flames still pouring onto the construct's legs, keeping it immobilized. Dren closed the final gap, charging toward the towering machine. He leapt onto a piece of fallen machinery, using it as a platform to vault upward. His combat knife was already in his hand, its edge glinting with the faint glow of energy. He landed on the construct's chest, directly over its damaged core, and drove the blade deep into the exposed mechanisms. The reaction was immediate. The machine convulsed violently, its core flaring and sputtering as Dren twisted the blade. Crimson light erupted around him, and arcs of energy lashed outward, one striking his shoulder and nearly throwing him off balance. "Pull back!" Torrin shouted, his voice frantic. "It's collapsing!" Dren yanked the blade free and leapt clear just as the construct let out a final, ear-splitting roar. Its frame buckled inward, the damaged core imploding in a burst of crimson energy. The force of the explosion hurled Dren across the chamber, his armor sparking as he slammed into the ground. For a moment there was silence. The massive construct lay crumpled in the center of the chamber, its glowing core extinguished. The faint hum that had filled the room since their arrival was gone, replaced by a deep, unnatural stillness. "Dren, report!" Ganon's voice cut through the ringing in Dren's ears. "I'm alive," Dren replied, forcing himself to his feet. His armor was scorched, his shoulder plate cracked, but he was functional. He glanced at the fallen Guardian, smoke rising from its shattered body. "Is it dead?" Torrin scanned the wreckage with his auspex, his visor flickering. "No readings, it's gone." Ganon stepped forward, his flamer lowered but still alight. "That thing nearly took us all with it. If there's another one of those down here..." "There isn't," Dren interrupted, his tone firm. He turned toward the faint glow still emanating from the central pillar, the machinery around it flickering weakly. This was the last line of defense. The Ethnarch isn't hiding behind more constructs, he's ahead. The faint glow of the central pillar pulsed weakly, the once dominant hum of the Ethnarch systems reduced to a fading whimper. The air around the chamber was thick with the acrid stench of molten metal and charred circuitry. Dren motioned the squad forward, his bolter raised, every step deliberate. Whatever lay ahead, he knew it wouldn't rely on the brute force of constructs anymore. The Ethnarch was waiting. "This whole place is dying," Torrin muttered, his voice rough. He limped slightly, but kept his bolter steady, his visor flickering with intermittent static. "The energy grid's collapsing. Whatever's powering this, whatever he's using, it's burning itself out." "Good," Dren said, his tone cold. "It means we're close." Ganon stepped up to the jagged remains of the pillar, flames still dancing faintly at the nozzle of his flamer. "You think he'll face us himself, or is he hiding behind more tricks?" "He's here," Dren said firmly. He pointed to the far end of the chamber where a narrow passage cut deeper into the rock. Unlike the other corridors they'd traversed, this one was smooth and clean, as if recently carved. Faint green light bled from its edges, spilling onto the floor in sharp, unnatural patterns. No constructs, no guards, Torn noted, his tone wary. It's too clean. He knows we're coming, Dren replied. Stay sharp. The squad moved into the passage, its oppressive silence weighing on them more than the chaos of battle ever had. The green light grew stronger as they descended, casting strange, flickering patterns across their armor. The walls here were marked with intricate carvings, alien and angular, their sharp lines twisting into shapes that made the eye linger too long. Dren forced himself to look away, his instincts screaming that these designs were meant to distract, to disorient. It's like the walls are alive, Gannon muttered, his voice hushed. They might be, Torrin replied. He adjusted his auspex, but his visor displayed only static. No readings, no heat signatures, no movement, just interference. The passage opened suddenly into a vast circular chamber. At its center was a raised platform, surrounded by machinery that pulsed faintly with green and red light. Standing on the platform, bathed in the unholy glow, was a figure both monstrous and regal, a tyrant of flesh and machine, watching them with unflinching malice. He was tall, far taller than a human, but his grotesque form bore the undeniable mark of Terran origin, twisted and augmented beyond recognition. Jagged metal jutted from flesh stretched taut, and cables snaked from his spine into the surrounding machinery, pulsing faintly as if feeding him power. The once human figure's face was a hollow mockery of life, a pallid mask interrupted by angular implants and a pair of eyes glowing green with cruel intelligence. "You've come far," the figure said, his voice hollow yet commanding, reverberating as though the chamber itself spoke for him. "Farther than most, but you are fools if you think you've already won." Dren stepped forward, his bolter leveled at the abomination. "Your machines are broken. Your armies are gone. This ends now." The figure's lips twisted into a faint, hollow smile. "Broken? Gone? Astartes, you've destroyed nothing. What stands before you is but a fragment of the work, an echo of what I will become. I am the future. And you." He gestured with one jagged claw, and the surrounding machinery surged to life, spilling blinding red and green light. Are relics of a dying age. The platform trembled, and the walls seemed to shift. From concealed alcoves in the chamber, things began to emerge. They weren't constructs, not entirely. These were warped horrors, sickening fusions of flesh and machine. Their limbs jutted at unnatural angles, skins stretched tightly over exposed servos and wiring. Their movements were jerky and twitching, as if their bodies rebelled against their existence, but their glowing, soulless eyes burned with purpose. "The last of my creations," the figure said, his voice mocking. "Perfection born of humanity's failures, and you will fall to them as all others have." Dren didn't hesitate. "Gannon, burn them. Torrin, cover the flanks. Push forward." The corrupted horrors surged forward, screeching as they moved. Gannon's flamer roared, its fire sweeping across the first wave. The abomination's skin blackened and blistered, melting into the mechanical components beneath, but they still stumbled forward, relentless even in their agony. Torrin fired in tight bursts, dropping two that lunged at their flanks, but more swarmed from the alcoves, their sheer numbers threatening to overwhelm. Dren's bolter barked as he advanced, each shot precise and controlled. The platform loomed above, and the creature that had once been the Ethnarch stood watching, cables pulsing with energy. The figure raised his clawed hands, arcs of energy crackling between them as he gathered power. "You'll die here," the figure snarled, his voice rising to a furious crescendo, "and your Emperor's dream will die with you." The creatures advanced with deliberate, jerking motions, their forms a strange fusion of machine and flesh. One broke away, darting toward Torrin with surprising speed. Its claw scraped across his armor, forcing him to stumble. Torrin fired a quick burst from his bolter, hitting the creature's midsection. It dropped instantly, collapsing into stillness. "They just keep coming," Torrin said, steadying himself as he reloaded. "They're defending something," Dren replied, his tone calm but urgent. His bolter tracked a second creature moving along the wall, and a precise shot brought it down. More emerged from the shadows, moving with an eerie synchronicity. "They're not going to let us through without a fight." Gannon stepped forward, his flamer igniting with a dull roar. The flame washed across the advancing creatures, forcing the nearest ones to fall back. "They don't like that much," he said, a hard edge to his voice. One staggered through the flames toward him, its movements sluggish, and Ganon stepped aside, directing another burst of fire to halt its advance. "Status?" Dren called as he advanced carefully, scanning for new threats. "Still functional," Ganon said, planting his feet and watching the line for any gaps. "They're slowing, but they're not done." Tauren took down another as it tried to lunge from the side, his bolter precise. "We don't have much time to waste," he said, the strain in his voice tempered by determination. "Whatever's powering this, it's ahead." Above them, the figure on the platform extended an arm, and a ripple of energy coursed outward. The machinery around it flared to life, spilling pulses of light into the chamber. The floor trembled as the cables attached to the figure pulsed faintly, their purpose unclear but ominous. "You are persistent," the figure said, its voice deep and resonant, echoing through the chamber. "But persistence alone will not save you." Dren kept his bolter raised, his attention locked on the towering figure. "Tauren, hold position. Ganon, cover the flanks." His voice remained steady, cutting through the tension. "I'll deal with it." Bolter fire echoed through the chamber as Dren advanced, stepping carefully past fallen debris and broken mechanisms. The figure on the platform turned to face him directly, its movements deliberate and unnervingly smooth. Its gaze steady and unblinking seemed to pierce through the shadows. "Come forward, warrior," it said, its tone both calm and challenging. "Let us see if you understand the price of your choices." The chamber trembled as Dren advanced, his bolter firing precise, measured bursts to clear the path ahead. Behind him, Tauren and Ganon held the flanks, their weapons roaring as they kept the tide of corrupted creatures at bay. Despite the chaos, Dren's focus remained locked on the figure above, the twisted remnant of the Ethnarch standing on the glowing platform. Cables pulsed like veins, feeding energy into his augmented frame as he loomed over the battle, his glowing eyes tracking Dren's every move. "All squads, report," Dren barked into the Vox as he moved. Static crackled in his helmet, followed by broken fragments of speech. "Eastern units report heavy resistance but are advancing," came one distorted reply. "Construct reinforcements at multiple fronts," said another. "The breaches are holding, but no contact from one sector," a third voice added before cutting out. Dren growled under his breath. The interference was worsening. Whatever power the Ethnarch was channeling into this place was disrupting communications across the battlefield. He needed answers. "Command, this is Squad Dren. We're engaging the core threat. What's the status of surface operations?" There was a pause before the reply came through, faint and fragmented. "Construct forces are collapsing across the outer defenses. Resistance is now concentrated near your position. The Ethnarch systems are destabilizing." Good. That meant the wider battle was turning in their favor, but it also meant that whatever was happening here was the Ethnarch's final stand. Dren adjusted his grip on his bolter and quickened his pace. "Ganon, Tauren, stay close," he called back. "The other squads are holding. This is on us now." The Ethnarch tilted his head slightly, as if hearing Dren's every thought despite the chaos of the chamber. His voice echoed through the room, amplified by the surrounding machinery. "So the Emperor sends you, his most obedient creations, to end what you cannot understand. Tell me, Astartes, do you ever question why you fight?" Dren ignored him, advancing steadily. His bolter barked as he dropped another charging hybrid, its malformed body crumpling to the floor. He vaulted over a shattered pillar, his boots striking the uneven ground with a sharp thud. "Do you believe in his vision?" The Ethnarch continued, his tone calm yet dripping with scorn. "Do you truly think your Emperor's dream will bring anything but ruin? Your kind was made to kill, not to rule." Ganon let out a sharp laugh, stepping through the haze of smoke as he unleashed another burst of fire toward the encroaching creatures. "You're wasting your breath," he growled. "We didn't come to listen to speeches." The Ethnarch's expression twisted, the faintest trace of amusement curling the corners of his ruined mouth. "Ah, the soldier's defiance," he said mockingly. "Tell me, do you feel it even now? The strain in your limbs, the weight of this endless war, how much of you is still human, and how much have you already surrendered to your chains?" "Tauren, status," Dren barked, cutting off the Ethnarch's monologue. "Flanks are holding," Tauren replied, his voice tight but determined. "More incoming, but they're slowing, like they're losing cohesion." Dren gritted his teeth. The hybrids weren't faltering because of the squad's firepower alone. They were tied to the Ethnarch's systems, feeding off his power. If Dren could sever that link, the entire defensive network would collapse. He adjusted his approach, angling directly toward the platform where the Ethnarch loomed. The towering figure raised a clawed hand, and the chamber groaned in response. The machinery around him surged with energy, beams of red and green light shooting outward in wild arcs. One struck a broken column, shattering it into fragments that scattered across the chamber floor. "Keep moving!" Dren shouted, breaking into a sprint. The air around him crackled with static as the energy beams intensified, carving molten lines into the ground. Another beam streaked past him, narrowly missing as it scorched the floor behind him, but he pressed forward. The Ethnarch extended both arms, his cables pulling taut as sparks erupted from the machinery tethered to his frame. The glow around him intensified, a blinding swirl of red and green light. "Do you see, Astartes?" he roared. "This is what your Emperor fears. The power of those who refuse his chains. The strength to forge our own destiny." Dren leapt onto the base of the platform, his bolter raised and ready. He fired 3 quick shots, striking the Ethnarch's shoulder and forcing him to stagger back. Sparks erupted from the impact, fragments of metal falling away to reveal the pale, scarred flesh beneath. The Ethnarch's glowing eyes narrowed, his voice rising in fury. "You dare challenge me?" The platform beneath Dren's boots vibrated with unstable energy, each pulse radiating through the chamber like the fading heartbeat of a dying beast. The Ethnarch steadied himself, his clawed hands flexing as sparks flew from the damaged shoulder. His glowing eyes burned brighter, locking onto Dren with an intensity that seemed almost alive. "You think yourself righteous," the Ethnarch spat, his voice venomous. "You kill in the name of a man who calls himself a god, yet you understand nothing of the power that lies beyond his reach." Dren advanced, bolter raised, his focus unwavering. "Save your sermons. They won't save you." The Ethnarch raised his arms, and the cables connected to his body snapped taut. The entire chamber responded, the machinery around them roaring to life. Panels along the walls began to shift, exposing intricate conduits that glowed with volatile light. The air grew thicker, charged with a suffocating tension that clawed at Dren's senses. "You speak of saving," the Ethnarch continued, his voice amplified by the machinery. "But all I see is destruction. You are no savior. You are a weapon, mindless and unthinking, wielded by a tyrant too afraid to confront the truths of the past." Before Dren could respond, a sudden tremor rippled through the platform. From below, a surge of red energy erupted, lancing upward and forcing him to step back. The Ethnarch's form became shrouded in the light, his silhouette twisting as the machinery surrounding him groaned under the strain. "Ganon, suppress the systems!" Dren shouted into the Vox. He fired into the glowing conduits nearest him, the explosive rounds rupturing their surface and releasing bursts of searing heat. The chamber shuddered as the damage spread, cracks splintering along the platform's surface. "I'm on it!" Ganon replied, his flamer roaring as he turned it on a cluster of exposed cables feeding energy into the platform. The flames engulfed the connections, melting them into slag. Sparks erupted in all directions, and the Ethnarch staggered as his supports began to falter. "You cannot destroy me," the Ethnarch roared, his voice blending with the rising wail of overloading systems. "I am the future of humanity. I am its salvation." Dren didn't slow. He advanced through the chaos, his bolter aimed directly at the Ethnarch's core. "You're nothing but a relic of failure," he said coldly. He pulled the trigger. The Ethnarch twisted sharply, dodging the bolter rounds as they struck the cables behind him, sending another burst of sparks across the platform. The light surrounding him flickered violently, the once steady hum of the machinery devolving into erratic surges. Dren adjusted his aim and stepped closer, his every movement deliberate, controlled. "You're persistent," the Ethnarch hissed, his voice uneven now, laced with strain. "But you fight for a cause already lost. Your Emperor's empire will crumble, as all empires do." Dren didn't answer. He advanced steadily, firing into the exposed conduits at the Ethnarch's feet. The platform shook as more of the machinery ruptured, spilling glowing fluid that hissed and evaporated into the air. The acrid fumes stung at the edge of his senses, but he pressed on. Torrn's voice cut through the Vox. "More of those hybrids are gathering below. They're moving erratically, like they're falling apart." Stay on them, Dren ordered, keeping his bolter trained on the target. This ends here. The Ethnarch staggered as one of the remaining cables snapped, the energy feeding into him sputtering. He extended a clawed hand toward Dren, arcs of unstable light sparking from his fingertips. A lance of energy erupted toward the Astartes, but Dren sidestepped it effortlessly, the blast scorching the floor behind him. I have transcended death, the Ethnarch growled, his movements faltering but defiant. You cannot kill what is already eternal. Dren ignored the words, closing the distance. The Ethnarch lashed out again, his movements slower now, the strain on his body apparent as sparks erupted from the remaining cables. Dren saw his opening. With a final burst of speed, he surged forward, slamming into the Ethnarch with the weight of his armor. The impact sent the augmented tyrant reeling, his mechanical frame sparking and cracking as he collided with a jagged piece of machinery. Dren raised his bolter, the barrel trained on the faint glow of the Ethnarch's exposed chest. The Ethnarch stumbled back, his movements faltering as the machinery around him sparked and groaned. The cables tethered to his frame pulsed weakly, their energy fading with each passing second. His glowing eyes flickered, and his voice, once filled with commanding authority, had grown strained. You think you destroy something greater than yourself, he said, his tone cracking under the weight of failing systems. But you fight for stagnation, not progress. Dren advanced slowly, his bolter steady. The platform shuddered beneath him as the chamber's tremors grew more violent. You chose tyranny, he said evenly. There's nothing left of your progress, but ruins. The Ethnarch raised a clawed hand, reaching toward Dren, though his movements were sluggish and weak. Sparks flew from his damaged frame as he tried to step forward, only to collapse against the crumbling machinery behind him. His form sagged under the weight of his failing systems, each breath coming slower. Dren, the whole structure is failing, Torin's voice came through the Vox, sharp with urgency. You need to finish this now before it takes us all down with it. The Ethnarch let out a distorted, hollow sound, almost like a bitter laugh. You think this is victory? You only delay what must come. The Emperor's grip on humanity will shatter in time. Dren didn't respond. He stepped forward, his bolter still trained on the Ethnarch's core. The light within the cables dimmed further, their flickering pulses barely illuminating the chamber now. Ganon, Dren said calmly over the Vox. Clear the remaining systems. Make sure nothing here survives. He steadied himself, his eyes fixed on the fading remnants of the Ethnarch's power. Without hesitation, he fired. The bolter round struck true, tearing through the flickering core at the center of the Ethnarch's chest. For a moment, the cables tethering him to the machinery twitched violently, sending one last burst of unstable energy rippling through the platform. The light in his eyes faltered, flickering faintly before fading entirely. His frame slumped forward, collapsing into the tangled remains of the failing systems around him. The chamber grew eerily still, save for the groaning of the overstrained machinery. Dren remained motionless, his bolter still raised, waiting for any sign of movement. None came. The Ethnarch's final defenses, his machines and corrupted creations, had failed. Target neutralized, Dren said into the Vox, his tone flat but resolute. Systems are shutting down, Torin called out from the flanks. The hybrids, whatever was driving them, are collapsing. Ganon's voice followed, calm but alert. Confirmed, secondary systems are degrading fast. This whole place is starting to come apart. Dren turned, stepping down from the unstable platform as tremors began to ripple through the floor beneath him. Sparks leapt from exposed conduits, and the walls of the chamber began to groan ominously, shedding loose fragments of metal and stone. The Ethnarch's death had triggered a chain reaction. Torin, Ganon, regroup now, Dren ordered, his voice steady despite the rising instability. We're done here. The two Astartes moved quickly, falling into formation as the tremors intensified. The glow of the collapsing systems illuminated the chamber in fractured bursts of red and green, casting their shadows across the ruins. As they moved toward the exit, Dren spared a final glance at the fallen Ethnarch, now little more than a broken husk among the ruins of his ambitions. There was no satisfaction in the victory, only the grim acknowledgement of another enemy defeated in the Emperor's name. The chamber quaked violently as the squad moved toward the exit, the dying machinery around them emitting bursts of light and heat. Sparks rained down, and the air filled with the sharp tang of burning metal. The floor beneath their boots cracked and shifted, each step more treacherous than the last. "Stability is dropping fast," Torrin said, his voice clipped but calm. His bolter was raised, scanning the shadows for any lingering threats. "We need to get out before the entire structure collapses." Gannon glanced over his shoulder, the nozzle of his flamer still glowing faintly from the earlier battle. "The tunnels won't hold much longer. Let's hope the surface isn't buried by the time we reach it." Dren took the lead, his stride purposeful as he guided them back through the narrowing passageway they had entered from. The once bright glow of the Ethnarch systems had dimmed to faint pulses, casting the walls in erratic shadows. Each flicker revealed more fractures spreading across the chamber's supports. As they moved deeper into the passage, the vox crackled faintly. A distorted voice broke through the static. "This is command. Surface teams are reporting. Collapse in progress. Status of the objective." "Objective eliminated," Dren replied, his tone sharp and efficient. "Structure is destabilizing. Extraction underway." "Understood," came the reply, though the signal was faint. "Surface forces are withdrawing to safe distance. Support will be limited if collapse continues." Dren cut the vox and quickened his pace, leading the squad through a sharp turn in the tunnel. The tremors grew stronger, dust and small fragments of rock cascading from the ceiling. The air itself felt heavier, as if the entire structure were on the verge of caving in. "Keep moving," Dren ordered. "This place isn't waiting for us." The squad pushed forward, their pace quick but controlled as the ground beneath them heaved and cracked. The once smooth walls of the tunnel were now fractured and unstable, shedding shards of metal and stone with each tremor. The air was thick with heat and debris, forcing their helmets' filtration systems to work overtime. "We're almost there," Torrin said, his tone tight as he scanned the flickering path ahead. His injury had slowed him, but he kept pace, bolter ready in case anything stirred from the collapsing shadows. The breach point should be just beyond the next turn. "Good," Dren replied, glancing over his shoulder to ensure the squad stayed together. "Gannon, keep watch at the rear. We don't know if there's anything left trying to follow us out." Gannon nodded, the glow of his flamer cutting faintly through the dust. "If anything's still moving in here, it won't for long." Another tremor rippled through the tunnel, and this time it was stronger than before. The ceiling above groaned ominously, and a large section of metal plating tore free, crashing to the ground behind them in a deafening roar. The squad stopped for a moment, their visors flickering as the shockwave sent debris scattering around them. "Move, now!" Dren barked, motioning forward as the tunnel behind them began to cave in. The squad broke into a sprint, their armored boots pounding against the unstable floor. The walls groaned louder, sections of conduit sparking and collapsing as they passed. Dust filled the air, thick and choking, but their path was still visible, a faint, flickering light at the end of the tunnel guiding them forward. Finally, they emerged into the breach point, a jagged opening in the side of the vault where they had first entered. Beyond it, the ashen skies of the Caucasus Wastes loomed, still thick with smoke and the faint flashes of distant battles. "We're clear," Torrin called, stepping out into the open air and scanning the horizon for any immediate threats. Dren turned back to the collapsing tunnel, his eyes narrowing as the last remnants of the Ethnarch's fortress groaned and buckled under its own weight. A low rumble echoed from deep within, followed by a final, thunderous collapse. Dust and debris surged outward, but the squad held their ground. "Command, this is Squad Dren," Dren said into the vox, his tone steady. "Objective is confirmed neutralized, extraction complete." The squad stood in silence for a moment, the dust settling around them as the echoes of the collapse faded into the distant rumble of the wastes. The Ethnarch's fortress was gone, reduced to rubble buried deep beneath the earth. What had once been a bastion of defiance, bristling with ancient technology and impossible creations, was now just another ruin in humanity's long, violent history. "Looks like that's the end of it," Gannon said, lowering his flamer. His tone was calm, but there was an edge of exhaustion in his voice. No more constructs, no more machines, just the ashes. Torrin leaned against a fractured piece of rock, rolling his shoulder as if testing his injured side. "It should feel like a victory," he muttered, looking back at the still smoking remains of the vault. "But it doesn't, not really." Dren turned toward his squad, his gaze lingering on each of them in turn. Their armor bore the scars of the battle, scorch marks, dents, cracks, but they were alive. They had completed their mission. He spoke with the quiet certainty of a leader who had seen many such moments. Victory doesn't feel like anything, it's just another step forward. The Vox crackled faintly in Dren's helmet, cutting through the stillness. This is command. All surface forces have withdrawn to a safe distance. Waste sector secured. Status of Squad Dren? Dren keyed the Vox. We're intact, he said simply. The Ethnarch is destroyed. His systems are collapsing. Area is clear. There was a pause before the reply came through. Acknowledged. The 18th Legion will regroup at forward position Alpha. Reinforcements en route to secure the remains. Return immediately for debrief. Dren closed the Vox channel and turned back to the horizon. The skies were dark, choked with ash, the sun a pale orb struggling to shine through the haze. He gestured toward the distant rendezvous point where faint lights marked the location of Imperial forces. Let's move, Dren said. We're not finished yet. The squad began their march across the wastes, their footsteps heavy but purposeful. Behind them, the remnants of the Ethnarch's empire faded into the smoke, nothing more than echoes of a defiance that had been extinguished. The trek across the Caucasus Wastes was as unforgiving as the battle they had just survived. The ground was a cracked expanse of blackened rock, scorched and fractured by centuries of war and decay. Occasional gusts of wind carried ash and grit through the air, scraping against their armor. Every step felt heavier now, the weight of exhaustion settling over the squad. Torin broke the silence, his voice steady but reflective. Do you think we've really stopped anything? The Ethnarch's fortress is gone, but what about everything he built? The weapons, the knowledge. What if it's buried deeper than we know? Dren's response came without hesitation, his tone firm. We don't fight to understand what the enemy leaves behind. That's for others to sort through. We fight to destroy the threat, nothing more. Gannon glanced back at the plume of dust still rising from the collapsed vault, faint against the gray horizon. Sometimes I wonder what the Mechanicum will dig out of places like that. They'll tear through the rubble looking for scraps of tech, maybe even pieces of him. You think they'll try to repurpose it? Dren didn't answer immediately. Instead, he scanned the horizon, his visor highlighting the distant beacon marking their rendezvous point. It doesn't matter what they find. What matters is that it's no longer in the Ethnarch's hands. That's a cold comfort, Torin muttered, though there was no argument in his voice. They continued in silence for several minutes, the faint lights of the forward position growing brighter with each step. The sight of Imperial banners rising above the makeshift outpost brought a subtle shift to their movements. The familiar symbols of the Raptor Imperialis, a reminder of the Emperor's greater purpose. As they approached the camp, a squad of sentries stepped forward to greet them. Their armor bore the same markings of the 18th Legion, though it was cleaner, unmarred by the recent battle. One of the sentries saluted, his voice sharp and respectful. Sergeant Dren, command is waiting for your report. Congratulations on the successful mission. Dren inclined his head briefly, his expression unreadable beneath his helmet. There's nothing to celebrate, he said simply. Debriefing will have to do. The sentry stepped aside, and the squad moved into the camp. A faint hum of activity filled the air as servitors and support personnel worked to organize supplies and reinforce defenses. The atmosphere was calm, but beneath it lingered the unspoken tension that accompanied every campaign. The knowledge that this victory was only one of countless battles yet to come. Dren led his squad toward the central command tent, his posture as steady as it had been in the Ethnarch's collapsing vault. Whatever came next, they would face it the same way they always had, with unyielding resolve. Thank you for joining this story of duty, sacrifice, and the grim darkness of the Warhammer 40k universe. If you enjoyed this tale of the Emperor's conquest, let us know by liking and subscribing. There is no end to the stories of humanity's endless war, and your support ensures that they continue. Until the next battle, for the Emperor.